GM Builders, this is The Engine. I'm your host, Sasha Berry. The Engine is a show about building business in Web3 and with Web3. So, whether you're already building in the space or you're trying to understand what this whole Web3 fuss is about, you're in the right place. Stick around. The Engine is powered by Skylab, a curated community of Web3 builders. Its mission is to find and support leaders in Web3. So check it out and consider applying to join. This week, my guest is MacLane Wilkison, one of the founders of Threshold Network, and we will talk about his journey as a founder. From MacLane's early days as an investment banker at Morgan Stanley to introduction to blockchain and meeting his co-founder at an early crypto meetup in San Francisco, to birth of NuCypher and its transformation to Threshold. We talk about how MacLane's vision of privacy as a fundamental right became the foundation of his company's ethos, how privacy overlaps with decentralization and self-sovereignty, MacLane's early fascination with decentralized technology that once launched can have an autonomous existence. We talk about what it was like to launch a business in crypto in 2015. MacLane reflects on some early learnings and the evolution of the company through the crypto winters. We talk about state of privacy in Web 2 today and what Web 3 can do to improve things. We talk about the formation of Threshold as the result of merger of two DAOs, two autonomous communities. So a lot of great stuff here. But first, a quick word about the Engine's core contributors this season, Threshold Network and Build Cities. Threshold Network provides a suite of threshold cryptography services. So if you're building an application that involves private data and trusting an intermediary won't fly, you may want to check out Taco, the only encryption and access control plugin that is end-to-end decentralized. So what is Taco for? Builders are using it in dApps that have to do with seed phrase recovery, crypto inheritance, media libraries management, or even concealing in-game assets. There are other possible applications, of course. You can use Taco to build a decentralized password manager or a location sharing plugin, or even a live streaming platform. Those are just some ideas. So go to threshold.network, check out Taco documentation, and see how you can easily integrate this plugin into your app. Build Cities is a global cooperative of startup cities. The world is changing rapidly. Resources and expertise that were consolidated into a handful of ecosystems for centuries are now crossing borders and flowing freely into new places around the globe. Passports and visas may still limit us physically, but we can teleport anywhere over Zoom. So Build Cities is creating the infrastructure, helping local communities to build and innovate. Check out their website and see how in this new world, Lagos is right next to London and Los Angeles, and Nassau is not far from Paris and Phuket. You can join the community right now with your Discord login, and you can mint their collaborative AI NFT that will become your pass to the ecosystem. Okay, now let's dive into my chat with MacLane Wilkison. MacLane, welcome to the Engine.
Hello, thank you.
Thank you so much for making time to be with us today.
Of course.
We're gonna talk about Threshold. We're gonna talk about the origin story of NuCypher and how it became Threshold. But before we jump into all of that, I want to start a little bit with the origin story of you. You got into crypto pretty early. In 2012, you were investment banker at Morgan Stanley, recent graduate. And how did blockchain came into your life? What was it? What was it to you at that time?
Yeah, like a lot of people had heard about Bitcoin a couple times, but never really had the time to really dig into it until I drove out to California after leaving my job in finance. And it was just sort of exploring. I was working out of a hackerspace called Hacker Dojo down in South Bay. We were just exploring like a bunch of different startup ideas. And at the time, Ethereum this was pre Ethereum launching, pre the Ethereum ICO.
Yeah.
But I randomly went into a meetup about Ethereum. I think it was maybe even Vitalik was like on the ICO roadshow maybe, and it just seemed very interesting. So that was my first exposure. They were talking about like smart contracts and all these things that I had never heard of. And then after that meetup, I kind of fell down the rabbit hole of, at the time, looking really deeply into Bitcoin. Went to the SF Bitcoin Devs user group, which was also at the Hacker Dojo, and I think there were like 6 of us. And in retrospect, it was, I was one of them. Michael, who co-founded NuCypher with me, and later Curve, was another. Zucky, who was one of the early contributors to Cosmos, and Tom Ding, who was one of the co-founders of Definity. So like in retrospect, like pretty lucky on my part to sort of have gotten involved so early with those people. But like, I mean, certainly like a totally different vibe and environment back then. 7 people showing up for a meetup than it is today, where I'm sure if you have a similar SF Bitcoin users group, the turnout is probably going to be quite a bit higher.
Yeah.
But Michael and I met at that user group and I think we both just started hacking on random things together. This was, again, pre-Ethereum. So like they had these protocols on top of Bitcoin that tried to add some functionality and expressivity called Mastercoin and Counterparty that we played around with, trying to just like understand and learn, like, beyond just like BTC as an asset or a medium of exchange, what can you potentially build, on top? And so we just did a lot of, random projects, and for a couple of years, we were very interested in general, I think, in like the privacy space. So obviously, Bitcoin as a blockchain is a totally transparent ledger, but we were interested in, okay, if, not obviously just privacy, transactional privacy, but also like, if you imagine like this idea, which at the time was just, an idea, none of them actually existed, but this idea of decentralized applications built on top of a blockchain that, arbitrary applications, presumably they need some kind of data privacy or access control piece for them to be viable. And that was a pretty clear, like, missing piece. So that was a part that attracted us for a while. We ended up starting a company, and back in this was, I think, 2015. We technically started the company. Was not a good time to be in crypto and in Bitcoin.
Well, hold on, before we get into 2015, let's back up a little bit. And well, first of all, you moved to San Francisco before you discovered crypto. So you moved because of just your interest in technology and building.
Yeah, I moved. I knew I wanted to build or to be involved in technology in a much more direct way than I thought was like sort of viable in New York. I had heard of crypto. Specifically, I had heard of Bitcoin.
Do you remember your light bulb moment? You remember that switch? What was it that made Bitcoin make sense for you? I mean, being a finance guy, like you probably connected to the financial aspect of it, but you're also in the technology and the technological side of it. Must have been exciting. Although Bitcoin at that time wasn't necessarily seen as a layer for building on top of.
I'm not sure there was ever like a specific light bulb, moment. I mean, I had worked in finance, but really just like for only 2 years. It's like the most junior position you could have. So I don't know that the finance aspect of it really clicked with me as much as more so the technology aspect of it. Like this is theoretically a platform where you can build, different types of applications on top of that bring basically a whole set of characteristics that aren't really possible to do in a traditional setting. So like censorship resistance. You could build like applications that just like run, autonomously on a blockchain. This is like the original idea of a DAO before like the definition kind of changed in recent years. But you could build, something that would just run by itself essentially, because all the miners or validators on the network are running the code that would persist like beyond the original creator. So the original creator, like very similar to what Satoshi did, he launched it and then just kept going, even though he or she or they disappeared. So I thought that aspect was very interesting. That just enabled this whole new class of applications, blockchain.
That's fascinating. And so that was what, 2013, 14?
Yeah, that would have been, so when Michael and I were just kind of like working together, like exploring different ideas. That would have been between 2013, 2014.
And so
And then in 20,
what was that exploration process? I mean, it took you some time before you were formed NuCypher. So what was that
Mhm.
process of getting to validating that as your direction?
Again, like at the time, this was before Ethereum existed. Um, so like the tooling was much less mature. Like there were these different protocols called Counterparty and Mastercoin, which we hacked on a little bit, that basically tried to add like essentially like add some metadata on top of Bitcoin, so you could in theory like create more sophisticated applications. So again, this is like almost a decade ago, so I'm trying to remember like some of this. Like we worked on like a toy like peer-to-peer lending application. We worked on like this insurance protocol that would like pay out in the event of some environmental disaster, for example, like an earthquake insurance
Yeah,
type of thing, which obviously requires some sort of oracle. And again, like none of these things existed at the time.
no oracles.
Um, Correct. Yeah. So we were just basically spending time like, okay, what's like what's like the landscape of theoretical ideas that could make sense, and then like what's possible today, not much, and then like, okay, within that, like if these things are going to be possible in the future, like what are like the missing pieces, and eventually we kind of narrowed in on one of the obvious ones was like this access control or data privacy layer.
The reason I'm asking about that exploration process is that I feel that a lot of times people rush into ideas and commit to something, and then don't want to move on when it's time. I've certainly been guilty of that, and I think it's very important to devote some time to saying no to things, saying no to ideas, and moving on through them. Um, Although it can be very difficult to sustain that kind of exploration. What was your experience like? How did you manage to keep exploring, doing that personal R&D?
Yeah, well, I mean, like to some extent, like we didn't have a choice, right? Like I had just left my job and moved out to California, and this is a very different like market in crypto back then than it is now. Like if you said the word cryptocurrency or Bitcoin or blockchain, like you were actively not gonna be able to raise any money. So we certainly didn't have the problem that people do now, or in crypto you're doing whatever the latest hot sector is in crypto, and you can raise an unlimited amount of money, like regardless of how early the idea is. So we didn't have like the problem of we're gonna like pre-commit to something that doesn't actually make sense, because that's something that people will fund. No one would fund anything. Um, so we were very incentivized to sort of quickly iterate through different things and build them, and see if any of them could actually work.
That's a very important part of discipline, I guess, right? That trains you well. So how did
Mm-hmm.
you go about funding your research and your early experiments?
Well, it was just us. So like we basically just had to have enough money to like survive, and like have some food and a really crummy place to live. So really there was no like overhead. Like we didn't have any other employees or anything. So like the amount of money was just like persisting off of whatever meager savings we had, and then like building up like a significant amount of credit card debt.
That's a big risk that one has to take on. Um,
Yep, I don't necessarily. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that approach.
what would you recommend?
Well, I mean, now obviously, if you're working in capital, this is much more available now than it was then. I think the harder issue now for people is, okay, like again, like what you pointed out, like just because you can raise X amount of money for something doesn't mean that, that's something that's worth committing a significant amount of time to. So capital is much cheaper now. Even, with like even over the last couple of years where we've had like, I guess a little bit of a crypto bear market overall, like much more mild compared to, the previous crypto bear markets when it wasn't even clear if Bitcoin was going to survive, the next 6 months to a year. So I think like people now, obviously like it's not universal truth for everyone, but like I think the harder problem now is like making sure that just because investors like something doesn't mean it's a good thing. It's going to work.
Yeah.
And being, I guess, more judicious about what you choose to work on.
Yeah. Well, the industry runs on narratives, and there's narratives that people get excited about, and they're not always right or valid or worthy. 2015, you started telling me that it was not a great time. So my
Yep.
question was, you kind of touched on that a little bit. Were there moments at that time in your exploration where you thought that blockchain thing is not going to work? Like, what am I doing here? Nobody believes in this. Like, what kept you in, and how?
Yeah. So what Michael and I ended up doing is we had identified like data privacy access control as like this area that we were interested in and wanted to build something in. So we started, writing code and building stuff. We were specifically building on top of this cryptographic primitive called proxy re-encryption. But again, because like it was just not viable to raise money as a crypto or a blockchain affiliated company, tangential company, really at all. I mean, with some exceptions, obviously, but we couldn't, at least.
Yeah.
So what we ended up doing is we were still working on proxy encryption, but for a period of time, we tried to basically sell it to like enterprises and financial institutions. So just building like the cryptography itself, not associating it with the blockchain piece. So we were just building like cryptographic libraries that you could use in a more traditional centralized setting. So for a while, we were trying to convince banks to use it, basically for they have record retention requirements, and so we were basically trying to convince them to encrypt it instead of storing all their data on premise in their own data centers. They could encrypt it, ship it off to like some cloud storage place, but still have access to it, and the ability to share it also via proxy encryption with regulators. So that was what we did. We were able to raise we were able to get into YC in 2016, raise a comparatively very small amount of money. I think like 600 or so K, including the YC money, and a small like angel round after YC. And then spent about a year or so basically in this very painful effort to try to sell it to banks, which, I'm very glad that we no longer have to do that. And then in 2017, early 2017, like this was when like the ICO started to become a thing, and like crypto beyond just, crypto basically started to make a comeback and become hot again. And we realized like, hey, like, we've been building this proxy encryption stuff. Now it's actually viable to raise money for something in blockchain and crypto, which is what we wanted to be doing anyway. And we could just take what we built already and again, like apply it back to blockchain like we had originally wanted. And we can raise money now. And, there's potential users in crypto. There's like the apps are now like actually a thing, not just like this vague idea that people are hand waving about. And so that's what we ended up doing in 2017. And we pivoted the company from working on like centralized cryptography libraries to building a decentralized network that ran on proxy encryption that the apps could use to basically provide data privacy and access control in their applications.
Right. I was reading up a little bit about NuCypher, and I liked how you said, I'll quote you: "We believe unconditional privacy is a basic human right, and NuCypher is created to assert privacy and self-sovereignty in the digital age." And so you had that vision and understanding in 2015 that blockchain will need that, where I think there wasn't much of that. There isn't much of it still in blockchain space. People value their privacy, but they don't really act as if they do.
Yeah, I mean, I think like privacy is not the same thing as decentralization, but a lot of the, I think it shares like there's a shared mindset base there between like the concepts of privacy, decentralization, and censorship resistance.
How so?
And so I think,
When you think about privacy, we're, who's listening, who's watching,
yeah.
who's collecting my data when I'm clicking on things. How is that connected to decentralization?
So I think the sort of shared principle between all of those things is like this idea of self-sovereignty. So like the idea that you as an individual should have the ability to, as part of your sort of fundamental human right, the ability to do certain things. So that's like the ability to transact, with people you choose to transact with in the financial sense, the ability to communicate certain ideas, have conversations that are at your discretion, private or public, or some on the spectrum in between, whether it's with private conversation with one other individual, or basically the ability to control who's able to access those communications.
Yeah.
Obviously, like historically, before computers, like this was trivial. You could just talk to someone, but obviously, like today, the vast majority of everything we do is digital. It's via the internet. Most of our conversations, at least for me, are not happening in person, but they're happening, in Discord, or Telegram, or Signal, or some chat medium. And I think that it's very easy just to sort of throw everything out there and not really realize that, for the most part, everything that you're doing online is like by at the permission of some other entity, whether it's a corporation or a government or an internet service provider, and so it's not something you have to worry about until you have to worry about it. It's not something you don't have to worry about, self-sovereignty in terms of transactions until your bank account gets blocked for some reason, which may may be valid, may not be a valid reason. But like once that happens, there's essentially nothing you can do. You don't have to worry about whether your communication is private until something happens. So like it's not hopefully these are not never problems that like most people run into in their day-to-day life. But I think it's important that there's some sort of underlying substrate where if someone does get censored, either in terms of financial, transactional sovereignty, or their ability to communicate with other people, that there is some kind of fallback mechanism that they can use to secure those fundamental rights. And I think that's certainly what blockchain or some blockchains provide in terms of transactional capabilities, and then what cryptography more generally can provide when it comes to data privacy and communication privacy.
Right. Well, it seems like in the
all under the umbrella of like self-sovereignty.
right.
Like you're not basically implicitly relying on the permission of someone else to transact or to communicate or to do the things that you should be able to do as an individual.
Yeah. Well, and it seems like that would be understood and accepted as a general, unconditional value. Yet we live in the situation, and we've defaulted into living with the intermediaries, and we don't even think about them that way. Like I went down the rabbit hole a little bit and dug up some numbers. So about 70% of people in America are concerned about government collecting their data. 70% don't trust corporations to act responsibly with AI. So again, like the data is the concern. 78% trust themselves to make right decisions to protect personal information. Yet 56% almost always click OK without reading the privacy policy.
Mm-hmm.
And I definitely include myself into that 56%. I don't even necessarily include myself into 78% of people who trust themselves to make right decisions about how my data is managed, because I know I have made wrong decisions so far because I've clicked OK on every button and I've been on all the social media all along. So it seems like, and then the saddest number of all is that 61% are skeptical that anything they do makes any difference. And that I'm definitely in. And I feel like we're so far down that road of, everything is seen, everything is observed. Um, and, I think many people think, okay, well, I'm not a criminal. I'm not doing anything wrong. They can watch me. I don't care. Um,
Yeah.
and and I feel like, maybe that's not a wrong thought, but it can be exploited by anyone at any given time. Um, and I'm originally from Russia, so I'm skeptical about everything. but and yet, even being skeptical about everything, I'm with everybody down that road. And how do we get back into a whole different way of thinking about our privacy and about our self-sovereignty? Because it takes work to be self-sovereign. It takes work to take responsibility for your privacy. And I feel like we're just too relaxed about it and we don't want to do the work.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think there are a couple pieces to unpack there. So one, like, I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with like using a lot of these, centralized services. Obviously, like they have a lot of benefits, right? Like,
Yeah,
I'm on social media. I have a bank account that, like, obviously, like these are things that we need in our society that we benefit greatly from. So like I don't think it's reasonable to tell people don't ever use these things.
right.
Um, I think what is important about blockchain and crypto and cryptography is that I think it is important that there exists some kind of fallback mechanism. So, if you're banned from social media, your speech is censored, if you're, unable to get a bank account because you're a sex worker or you like work in the marijuana industry or something that's not even illegal, but many times like you're just going to get banks aren't going to be willing to to work with you even though your activity that you're doing is completely legal. I think it's important that there's some kind of fallback mechanism that people do have access to in the event that they need it. And then I think the other thing to keep in mind is like, the objection that, oh, I have nothing to hide, I'm not a criminal. I mean, that's fine. Like most people most people are not criminals. Like most people, um, hopefully are never going to have any kind of like issue in their lives as far as that goes. I would say that like there is a history. I mean, in the United States, we're fortunate that on a relative basis, certainly compared to some other regimes in the world, like the U.S. government is relatively liberal. But obviously, like we've seen historically, like the U.S. government can still, even though it's relatively liberal, behave in very malicious and targeted ways. Like the world isn't always going to be the way that it is today in 2024. And even today, like the U.S. government and other relatively liberal governments, can do unfair or sort of extrajudicial things that aren't they're not technically supposed to do, but at that point they're the government, so who's going to hold them to account? But even if you ignore like the possibility of that, like when you say you have nothing to hide, like do you have enough? You also necessarily want to like expose yourself to essentially like the influence of corporations who are interested in basically bolstering their own profit. Like I personally don't. Like I'd prefer not to expose myself to an unbelievable amount of like targeted advertisements or targeted content that is either trying to sell me something or just like make me super engaged by releasing like dopamine hits on like the social media feed, so like I just keep scrolling forever. Like I don't think those are generally like good things, for me as an individual, or anyone as an individual, even though like they might be very, very enjoyable in the moment. So I don't think it's just about like, oh, I'm not a criminal, I have nothing to hide. It's also like, basically controlling your consumption, or controlling who has right access into your brain, and who might want to like influence your behavior in ways that you know are in their interest but not necessarily yours.
And so how do you see we get out of that? How do we get on a different rail?
Well, I think one, like certainly Bitcoin and Ethereum and a few other blockchains do provide like that fallback rail. So they're censorship resistant transactions, where you're sort of, assuming you have, some sort of self custodied crypto asset, like you do control those. No one can stop you from sending those, transacting on chain. I think the other aspect, so that's the transactional sovereignty aspect. The other aspect of of privacy, I think this is where like cryptography more generally, comes in. Whether it's traditional cryptography, like traditional public private key cryptography, where you can have private one-to-one communication with people, or more generally like threshold cryptography, which is obviously what we were working on at NuCypher, which is now threshold, which can enable like a lot of I think complementary applications. So certainly, I think like the transactional privacy and the communications privacy are like the two most important. And then there's a lot of people working on various decentralized applications that are more sort of privacy preserving, or privacy respecting, that could give people like an alternative to some of these sort of more intrusive centralized applications, which again, like, I think are totally valid for people to use. Like, I don't want to tell people stop using social media, stop using like a traditional bank account, stop using, SMS, stop using unencrypted chat applications. Like, there's certainly a place for those.
Right. Well, and hopefully over time there will be more decentralized applications that have that um, different rails underneath, and maybe.
Yeah, I think my main point is I think it's important that there's just the option there, so that if people want to self-select into that, they have the option, and it's just they're not forced into only using decentralized platforms where they can be censored,
Yeah.
or blocked, or banned.
Yeah. Well, and hopefully, people learn about those over time. And that's, I guess, what we're here for. And as you touched a bit on threshold cryptography, and I want to start, getting into the story of threshold. Can you touch on a little bit in more or less layman terms? What is it that threshold cryptography gives in that sense of protecting privacy?
Sure. So specifically for data privacy, what we were working on in NuCypher was this idea that something called proxy encryption. So this idea that a user could encrypt some data and then send it to storage or some application. Of course, most applications are like multi-user, so you can of course encrypt data, store it somewhere, but if you're the only person with a private key, you're the only one who can access it. Like, there's no way for some other user of the application or the application itself to decrypt that data and do something useful with it. What proxy encryption allows you to do is allows you to selectively grant access to encrypted data to another key. So if you're building like a healthcare application, for example, you can encrypt your health data and then selectively grant access to all of it or portions of it with your healthcare provider, your doctor, and basically enabling this multi-user aspect for encrypted data. And what we could do with basically the idea of threshold cryptography is that you can take a lot of traditional cryptography primitives, whether it's just public private key cryptography or proxy re-encryption, And instead of one key, one entity, you can basically split up a key into many different pieces, and then require some threshold or some quorum of all the participants that hold one of those shares to come together in order to perform some operation. So in the case of block tree encryption, you need like X of Y or like 5 of 10 or whatever your threshold is of shareholders to basically come together and agree to perform a re-encryption and grant access to someone. In the context of a signature, you need, GPTC, for example, you need 51 of 100 of the key shareholders to agree that this is a valid transaction. We're all going to collectively sign and create like a valid signature. So it's like, I think threshold cryptography is like a concept, is very complementary to blockchains, because blockchains have this concept of many different sort of non-aligned participants can agree on something, primarily through like correct economic design and incentives.
Mm-hmm.
And that's very similar to what you need for like threshold cryptography. You need a bunch of different participants to basically come to some kind of consensus that they should or should not sign a transaction or enable a decryption or do some basically cryptographic operation. And so this idea, both have this sort of underlying idea of your reducing the trust that is inherent, like you're placing in any one, and you're splitting it across many different actors or individuals or entities.
Right. Well, so to an untrained eye, it can seem that the principle is very similar. You have to reach a consensus to have the transaction or interaction go through. So what is the difference between blockchain and threshold cryptography?
Sure. Yeah. So I think the relation is that like blockchains are essentially like consensus machines, right? They're a way, they create like some economic incentive for a bunch of different participants to come to an agreement that, in the case of blockchains, like should these transactions be included in the next block, and what's the valid, what are the valid previous blocks that we're going to build on. And so what's interesting in terms of using blockchains with threshold cryptography is like, if you're using threshold cryptography without a blockchain, you basically need some kind of, you have to choose like who's the group of participants in this threshold cryptography protocol. Like if it's a threshold signing thing, like let's pick like a whitelist of like, I don't know, banks or something, that all these financial institutions will have a private key. But like, someone has to choose who's on that list, etc. So you can use blockchains, you can kind of piggyback off of the blockchain to use that as consensus for your threshold cryptography protocol. What we're doing at NuCypher and now Threshold is we basically create a group of eligible participants in some threshold cryptography protocol that are sort of derived from the blockchain. So all the threshold stakers are staking the threshold key token on chain, on the Ethereum blockchain, and that essentially qualifies them to participate in the various threshold cryptography protocols that are used, whether it's threshold signatures or threshold encryption and decryption, etc. So like blockchain is kind of one way to solve the question of, okay, I have a threshold cryptography protocol. Who are the people that are going to be participating in this protocol?
Right. You were building it before Ethereum was around. Like, what was your idea about that at that time?
Well, we were hacking on various things before Ethereum was around.
Oh, okay.
And I think like it was interesting because, again, like a lot of this has sort of been clouded in my memory by the fog of time. It's so long ago. But I do remember like, people were very excited about the idea of decentralized applications. Right. Like at the time we just had Bitcoin, essentially. It was just vanilla Bitcoin. Basically you could send someone Bitcoin, you could hold Bitcoin. But even then people were like, wait a second, you can theoretically build, and not to say that any one of these is a good idea, but like I distinctly remember, oh wow, you can build like a decentralized Uber on top of the blockchain. And so like even then people realized like, okay, assets and like transactions and currency or money are not necessarily like the only application that could be interesting that would benefit from censorship resistance and decentralization, like potentially like a lot of other things. And so like what we did was we thought, okay, like assuming there is some world, 10 years from now or however long from now where those things do make sense to build, like what are like the missing pieces? And one was this idea of you need some like some way to do like encryption and decryption or access control, some way to do signatures. And so like threshold cryptography, I think was like a, it felt like it wasn't clear exactly how the puzzle pieces would connect, but it sort of felt intuitively that there was a lot of overlap and that there'd be some interesting way for those two things to fit together. And obviously we took like that detour for a couple years where, we were waiting on like the ecosystem to mature before we could fit back well enough into the puzzle. But and that's where we were trying to sell it to banks and financial institutions. But eventually, like enough of the other pieces kind of got together where it felt like it was viable to, or there were enough other people finally building these decentralized applications where it made sense for us to pivot it back to blockchain.
So you mentioned selling to banks not necessarily working out as you expected. What were some of the other things that you made bets on and had to pivot from?
Yeah, well, so proxy encryption itself. So like the original. So I think we when we started NuCypher, or maybe I would say more like once we pivoted back to blockchain, we sort of quickly sort of generalized the idea of NuCypher being like a proxy re-encryption network into NuCypher being like a more generic threshold cryptography network, where proxy encryption would be like the first version of threshold cryptography that we would build, but eventually we would build like threshold signatures, threshold encryption, et cetera, and other things. I think what is very interesting about cryptocurrency and blockchain is it has been a way to, I think, accelerate new cryptographic primitives much into production much more quickly than they would have happened, outside of the blockchain context. So again, like we were trying to sell proxy encryption to financial institutions. It was unbelievably hard. Like obviously, like for legitimate reasons, they're quite conservative.
Yeah.
Both from a technology perspective, but also from like a vendor and procurement perspective. But with crypto, or cryptocurrency and blockchain, you can just build some interesting, useful new cryptographic primitive, and it's pretty likely that people will try it out and use it. Because the space is so new, and like I think like ZK proofs are a great example of that. Like Zcash, I think like probably by at least a decade, maybe more, accelerated the adoption of zero knowledge proofs.
Yep.
By basically first using them for essentially like a transactional privacy version of Bitcoin. We had a lot of early usage and feedback on proxy encryption that would have been impossible to get, from a financial institution in terms of like actual apps and startups using it and trying it out. But ultimately, like one of the things we learned is like proxy encryption. The use cases are pretty narrow, mainly because it imposes like a pretty significant user overhead in terms of like requiring multiple interactions. And it's relatively inflexible.
Mm-hmm.
So what we've done now for Threshold is we've kind of migrated the access control product into a more generic threshold encryption and decryption scheme, which relaxes like some of like, if you kind of have like a spectrum of like on the one end is proxy encryption is like the most secure, most hardcore, most like I distrust everyone on this side, and then like on the other side of the spectrum is like everything in plain text over the wire, and like anyone can see this, the government can see it, every company can see it, everyone can see it. Threshold encryption decryption is a little bit closer to a little bit still kind of towards like the I don't trust very many people's side,
Mm-hmm.
but it relaxes some of the trust assumptions in with the trade-off of being much more flexible. So it's much easier for developers that are building decentralized applications to incorporate it into their application. The UX is much better from a user perspective. Like, it doesn't require as many interactions on their side. And so that was one of the things we learned, is that this, for most applications, proxy encryption is sort of like a little bit too extreme.
Mm-hmm.
It's still available within threshold, but we relax some of those assumptions at the benefit of making it much easier to use by sort of migrating towards threshold encryption and decryption.
Right. Well, so there's two learnings. I guess one is that the crypto space is more open to testing things, and I think that's one of the challenges with our space also, is that it's great and we like each other's things and we try them and we think they're cool and we like to tinker with them, but they remain sort of obscure and just too weird for the mainstream.
Yeah, and then also, like, I think there is also another trade-off with, like, with the benefit of people being willing to try sort of new cryptography primitives and interesting new sort of, not just cryptographic primitives, but like approaches to smart contracts or blockchain approaches. Like, there is the trade-off of, okay, like, it can enable you to move a lot faster and to ship things faster, which I think is one of the most important things. But that, as we've seen in this industry, unfortunately, it's very easy to abuse that. So, like, yes, like, moving quickly and shipping things quickly is very important. But I think a lot of times people have sort of taken that to too much of an extreme. They play it sort of too fast and loose, and they ship something that is unfortunately insecure.
Mm,
So that's where, like, you can ship stuff quickly, but if you ship it too quickly and you just don't, take the care and do audits and make sure that it actually works and isn't, there's nothing that can
yeah,
be exploited. Like, obviously, we've seen that, like, exploits in this industry have lost hundreds of millions and billions of dollars. So that's the
yeah,
I think
and
it's easy to go overboard with just shipping things quickly because you can, and
yeah.
unfortunately, like, oftentimes people are very financially incentivized to do so.
Well, and we see that even with big players and companies that we kind of assume have done the homework. And I'm not going to point fingers here, but there's been quite a few in the last year. I hope that yeah, I hope there's the ethos of shipping responsibly and breaking things responsibly emerging, because yeah, I think it's easy to spook people, because money's at stake and it's not a joke. um,
Yep. Yeah, and it's a difficult balance to strike. I mean, I think certainly at times we probably erred on the overly conservative side in terms of not shipping fast enough. But yeah, I think it, you know, given that you're dealing with sort of financial infrastructure in the space, like, I think the burden should be, correctly a little bit higher to not just sort of
yeah,
YOLO ship things that they're going to cost users real money.
yeah, for sure. I want to get into the threshold era of threshold, and talk a little bit about how did the merge come about. So
Yep.
threshold is a, a merged entity that came from the two parent companies that connected into one DAO, and each of the companies was a DAO previously. So that was one of the early DAO mergers. So can you talk a little bit
Mhm.
about how that? Why did you want to do that in the first place?
Yeah. So I think this was back in like 2020, 2021. NuCypher launched on mainnet. Uh, and at that time, we had started to think again of, like, NuCypher is not just a proxy encryption network, but on the path to becoming like a generic threshold cryptography network.
Right.
So when it first launched, it supported threshold proxy encryption, but obviously we had ideas to include threshold signatures, threshold encryption, decryption, and potentially other things. And then there was another project called Keep Network, which I think was in a very similar position. They had recently launched on mainnet. At the time, they had built threshold signatures, threshold EC and DSA, and specifically they had built it for their Bitcoin bridge, TBTC. So they were at the time working on like different, one access control, proxy encryption, the other bridging and threshold signatures. But it was pretty clear, like from an architectural standpoint, that those Keep and NuCypher were probably like, of all the projects in the space, like those were the two that were most similar to each other. And kind of obvious that like eventually like NuCypher would probably try to build some kind of a threshold signature bridge, and Keep would do something in the access control space. And they had, which makes sense, they had quite a bit of overlap in terms of their communities. So I think like, because they had similar technology, similar use cases, similar interests, a lot of people were drawn to both projects. And I think it kind of became obvious to a lot of the community that, hey, maybe there's an opportunity there. Instead of sort of building very similar things on two different networks, two different sets of token holders, two different sets of stakers, etc. If they just mushed these two things together and created like one single network where all the activity, all the applications, all the use cases, all the different cryptographic primitives, all the community, all the developers, all of the stakers and people running nodes would just be all doing that in one place. So I think it probably was the first merger, like decentralized network merger of two production networks running on mainnet that had like a live token. And it was interesting. I think I'm not sure if the old forums are still up, but if they are, you can go and you can look through like the original post from the community members saying, hey, this might be an interesting idea.
So that came from the community, the idea.
Correct. Yeah. Because like at that point, like so we have, I'm the founder of a company that built NuCypher network, but the network was launched and its own thing, distinct from our development company. And similarly with Keep, like they had a company that had originally built the network, but they had launched it, and now it was a network running on its own, independent of either of the companies. Mm-hmm. And so like neither of us had any ability to like say, okay, these networks are merging. It was up to basically all the token holders to collectively sort of decide that they wanted to do that. So you can see like over a course of a couple of months, like the two communities sort of collaborated to try to figure out, one, how would this work at all, because like nothing it had happened before in terms of two decentralized networks sort of merging. Two, like what would the terms be? And three, like basically iterating towards some kind of mutually agreeable solution that sufficient quorum of both token holders would agree to. And eventually, what they landed on was there would be a new token called T, but the token supply would be entirely from existing new token holders and Keep token holders electing to wrap or upgrade their legacy tokens into the new T token. So basically, you could sort of merge, basically like people opting in those two existing networks into one. And so that's very, very broadly, how that worked.
Yeah. Well, and so what was your role at the time? Like, how did you feel about this whole initiative coming? Did you participate in those conversations with the community? Did you encourage that process? Were there other people kind of leading it? Like, how was it? How did it go?
Yeah, I would say, so I'm like the CEO of the development company that originally built NuCypher. And then obviously like we were, supporting the network, releasing patches and upgrades to the network and working on the underlying cryptography libraries. Mm-hmm. And we were also interested in potentially building some kind of like Bitcoin bridge, a very natural sort of use case for threshold signatures. And of course, Keep had already built, version 1 of TBTC. And I thought, from my perspective, I thought it was an interesting idea to merge the two, and like potentially could, accelerate a lot of the work that we had yet to do on a decentralized Bitcoin bridge on top of NuCypher. So I was generally supportive, although the process the process was primarily like the iteration and design of how the merge would work was done by the community, because we obviously had a lot of our own sort of existing development work that we were continuing to do. And then once it was decided, once both communities basically said, yes, we want to do this, then we kind of helped with the smart contract development in terms of like the contracts that would allow people to upgrade their NuCypher tokens or their keep tokens into T. But yeah, we let the community sort of do the governance piece of yes, no, should we even do this in the first place?
Yeah, no, that's totally fascinating. How those things become their own organisms and have their own will.
Yeah, and I think if you remember, like that was one of the things that when I initially got into Bitcoin and fell down that rabbit hole, that was one of the things that I was super interested in. It's like, okay, you can create things that like persist beyond like the original creator, even being involved. Because like you have basically this, if you design it correctly, you have like the incentives aligned such that all these different people will engage with the network and keep it running of their own sort of because of their own sort of economic interests or their own basically like incentive alignment.
Yeah, no, it's kind of, I guess, the ultimate joy of that process is you let that thing out into the wild, and it has its own volition, and it thrives. Well, we're coming up at time. I do want to ask you, just where things are right now, and where are we going this year with Threshold?
Sure. So when Threshold first launched, or when basically essentially the merge was possible, people could upgrade their new or their keep to T. That was the beginning of, I believe 2022 when that was first possible, like January 2022. Initially, we redeployed the proxy encryption network on top of Threshold. So instead of NuCypher stakers running the nodes, it was now T stakers. And then a few months later, TBTC v2 launched on top of Threshold. So like that was like the new decentralized Bitcoin bridge that now ran on Threshold. Since then, TBTC v2 has been kind of incrementally adding functionality and increasing its censorship resistance and decentralization. We've also sort of moved away from the strictly proxy encryption piece to more of a threshold encryption decryption model, which we call TACO, which stands for Threshold Access Control. That also recently launched about a month ago on mainnet on Threshold. So I think what you'll see over the next year is hopefully a lot of projects starting to adopt TACO and using that in their application for access control. And then hopefully, TBTC continuing to gain market share and to grow, hopefully, very successfully leading into the Bitcoin halving. And with the launch of all these new Bitcoin L2s, I think there's a very interesting opportunity for TBTC to be kind of the canonical or de facto bridge that most of these Bitcoin L2s begin to use.
Oh, that's interesting. I just want to double click quickly on TACO. You mentioned that you anticipate applications coming on and using it. What are some of the use cases that you think or of that are coming on and using it?
Sure. So yeah, TACO basically is a threshold encryption decryption protocol that runs on top of Threshold network. So all the stakers in Threshold collectively create like an encryption key used via something called a distributed key generation ceremony. And then if enough of them agree, they can decrypt data at the request of some user. And usually, like they would agree if some specified conditions were met. So, like let's say again going back to the healthcare example, which I don't know if this is the best application, but I think it's easier for people to kind of wrap their head around. You build some electronic health records application using TACO. You can encrypt your health data, upload it somewhere, and then grant access to your doctor. And anyone can ask, hey, please decrypt this data for me. But like the network would check, okay, is this the doctor's, is this the actual like a valid request? Or so should we approve this request and should we decrypt the data for them, or should we reject the request and say no? So that's like at a high level what it is. And then some of the early adopters of Taco, which I believe have already run DKGs for their applications. One is Masterfile, which has been building on top of Threshold and previously NuCypher now for a couple years. And they're using it basically to for essentially what's like a decentralized DRM protocol. So they're basically creating like loot boxes or other things for brands, where brands can sell collectibles to their community or their fans. And these are in many cases like traditional brands, so like not like Web3 brands, but like people like theoretically like Disney or Marvel or something. And they can sell art or other types of IP that via an NFT, and only the NFT holder has the ability to decrypt like the actual art or the actual content. There's another project called Holonym, which I believe is using it for like seed phrase recovery. Taco. So like if you lose your key to your crypto wallet, you could potentially like recover it via the Threshold network.
Ooh, that's important.
And a bunch of other applications that are in the works as well.
Well, cool. It was really, really interesting and fun talking to you. Is there any last thoughts? Any final wisdom?
No, I mean, thank you, Sasha. This was great. Appreciate you making the time and having me on.
Awesome. Thank you so much, MacLane. That was a fun chat. For more of these, follow the engine on all the platforms. Stay connected. Leave us a comment and tell us how you feel about your privacy these days. Check out Skylab's website and apply to join. Check out threshold.network and their Taco access control plugin. Join Build Cities and mint a dream on their website. And find all of us at ETH Denver. Build Cities is hosting a special one-day conference, Building Network States, just a mile from the main venue on March 1st. All links are in the description. And that's our show for today. Struggle well, fellow builder. You can do it. The winter is not forever. Cheers.